Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this short video so that you would have a little bit of background on the section of the benchmark that's about the Christian church. It's something that we really didn't get to talk about in class. So if you had questions about it, this video might be helpful. Just a few things. First of all, the first bullet kind of just gives us an idea of some of the core beliefs of the Christian religion, something that comes into fruition from Judaism during the time of the Roman Empire. So by the time we reach the European Middle Ages, Christianity had spread a great deal. Some of the institution of the church also becomes a little bit more organized. And so some of the beliefs become a little bit more unified and noted by the church. So one thing that Christians believe is in salvation, or this idea of eternal life, so that there is, after death, continued life in heaven. This is also related to this concept of sin. Something that Christians try to avoid is too much sin, and there's a great deal of emphasis on the concept of sin, which could enable somebody maybe after death to be sent to hell rather than to heaven. Christians come to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that sin ultimately gets forgiven because of the resurrection of Jesus. And there's also a belief in something called the Trinity. So there is a sense that Jesus, God, and a Holy Spirit kind of exist as a higher power in sync and on equal terms. And so that's kind of known as the Trinity. The church as an institution has a lot of significance in the Middle Ages. So we see the church being something that people, say, in a surrounding village have to rely on, because people who are Christian seek out what's known as the sacraments. And sacraments could be earned when there might be something like a wedding. So marriage might have been a sacrament after the 1100s. It's not one of the original sacraments. And another example of a sacrament might be baptism, in which case somebody is invited into the Christian church, something that might be done in infancy, but can also be done later on. And so baptism is kind of a formal introduction into the church, and that cannot be done by an individual like on their own. So something that people who are Christians needed was the church and the priest who would be involved in the church, because the priest could help with giving sacraments. And there's a variety of sacraments that come at different points of Christians' lives. Excommunication is this power that the church has. To some degree, maybe it gives the church a little bit of a form of power over secular rulers. This would be being able to excommunicate people who violated some sort of rule of the church. And excommunication means that somebody would no longer be invited into the church. They wouldn't have access to salvation. So excommunication is something that would be really problematic to a Christian. There's also the idea of having one entire, prince's community be excommunicated. And so, the textbook kind of talks about those types of things that the church holds over not only individuals, but also over secular leaders. There is a form of church law known as canon law. So the church is also creating its own kind of moral law. The church also has its own judicial system. So even though somebody who is a member of the church or works for the church could be, committing a crime, sometimes the way in which they would be tried would be in a justice system, in a court really run by the church. So there's some overlapping powers between the church and what we would call the secular state. Okay. There's also monasteries and convents. So sometimes we see the role of like the pastor or the priest who might be granting sacraments and might be running a church in a medieval village. There's also individuals who might not be ordained as priests, which is a sacrament in and of itself, but might be serving the church in a prayerful way in a monastery or in a convent. And monasteries were for men, monks, and convents were for women or nuns. And these were places where people dedicated, a lot of their time to either work or prayer. And for the most part, these were spaces where there was they were isolated often from society. This is also the group of people that tended to be literate in the society. They were encouraged to read. And after the order of St. Benedict, where they became reforms, for a long time there weren't specific reforms. The Benedictine rules kind of suggest that there should be much more strict rules. So, for example, vows of silence, vows of celibacy, not to get married, maybe vows of taking on no property of one's own. Things like that might be rules of a monastery or a convent. And there were some very religious people in these institutions, but of course there's also people who are seeking some sort of access to some sort of life that is going to be at least free from conflict and offering some protection. So there are people who choose life in a monastery without there being any religious incentive. So that exists to a high degree too. In some cases, women might choose life in a convent. It tended to be a very different type of lifestyle that might lend itself to literacy, where other aspects of life may not have. And it's usually something that's not open to anyone. So peasants, for example, couldn't easily become a monk or a nun, but there is a way that for some individuals who had resources, this does become an option. Tithing is money that's basically collected by the church, and ultimately this is expected. There's not really a choice. A certain amount of one's wealth one would give to the church on a frequent basis, and ultimately the church kind of collects this. And the church also doesn't pay any taxes on its land, so it becomes kind of a owner of some resources during the time period of the Middle Ages. And Mass, the kind of celebration of a variety of sacraments or whatever, would be done in classical Latin. Most people could not understand Latin, so Masses were always done in a language that people generally weren't able to be a part of. Maybe over time might memorize certain phrases or prayers, but oftentimes there would be illustrations to kind of assist people. A few other things about the church. This is just an example of a tympanum. It is the Day of Judgment, which is outside one of the areas of the Notre Dame Cathedral in France. There was, a fire there not too many years ago, and you've probably heard of Notre Dame as it's a college, of course, in the U.S. They play football and whatever, but it's also a cathedral in France, and you can Google an image of it. It's a great example of Gothic architecture, the type of architecture that tends to replace Charlemagne's type of architecture, which was called Romanesque, kind of like a play on some things that might have been Roman. Gothic is like over the top with a whole bunch of arches, which is what we see here, and a whole bunch of like figures, an ornation kind of in the actual sculpture or whichever. We don't see a lot of freestanding sculpture in the Middle Ages, but this kind of use of trying to have almost like what's a 3D, kind of work on the side of a church. It's another place to kind of send messages to a public that is largely not literate. One of the things you might notice here is there kind of are three levels that plays on to this concept of Trinity and Christianity. On the very top level, we see seated kind of in the middle is Jesus Christ, and we can get a sense of that because of the cross in the background. There are, kind of representations of the spear that killed Christ on a cross. So we have some angels, who are present, and we also have religious figures, saints, who are kind of on either side, just to give us a sense of the priority being in this, space where, think of, in Christian worldview, Jesus is kind of, seeing and overseeing salvation and access to heaven. In the very, very bottom, there is a description in visual form of the resurrection, so ways in which, this body of Jesus Christ becomes something that then is going to be, seen in heaven. It's the middle phase that's perhaps most important in terms of getting us a sense of this Middle Ages worldview. And this is where we get the title, the Day of Judgment. On the left-hand side, we see individuals who are going to be entering into heaven, and they're kind of connected to this angel figure here. And there is this weighing of people's souls. So these would be people who had good souls and, whose weight ultimately enabled them to be able to go upward. And they kind of have an upward look on their faces as they're kind of looking where they're going to end up in heaven. In the case of this side, we're seeing kind of devils and like a devil's assistant or whatever. And these would be people whose souls don't necessarily give them access to heaven, but rather give them access to hell. So there's the constant reminder in Christianity about what one's fate might be based on decisions people are making on earth, what's going to happen after death. And, lifespans are short, so people have like a little bit of time to think about this. This imagery, is kind of connected to the way we might see the Christian worldview. Another thing about this, just to give us a sense of how this fits into feudalism. So again, as noted, there is this thing called canon law. It's like the church's law. It's written by the church, and it speaks to, what people can and can't do, based on what the church says. It's different than, criminal codes for a particular society. And because the Christian church is really overseeing lots of different areas of Europe, this is like superseding, in a sense, the laws of the land. This might be additional laws that are church-driven. Just like many people today follow a variety of different religious, moral codes or ethical codes. There is also this idea of the Christian church on some occasions being involved in justice. There's this thing known as justice by ordeal, seeing if somebody is guilty of, or innocent of a crime might have happened because a noble weighs in and says, oh, I think the person's guilty or innocent. Sometimes the church also weighed in on that, or church leaders, and they might actually create some sort of test to see if somebody was like spiritually telling the truth, standing on hot coals, for example, something like that. So there is this idea of what's called trial by ordeal, and priests would have the opportunity to then decide if somebody was guilty or innocent. There's also this thing known as relics, and knights might come before a battle to the church and pray on Christian relics. Relics might be actually, a bone from a saint, or it might be something that was believed to have been left from the resurrection of Christ, some actual artifact that people kind of launch to and get stored in a particular place, and people believe has a certain degree of power. So there is, in a sense, some ways in which there are traditions that kind of the Christian church has organized, for this time period. There's also land. So as noted before, the church is an owner of land and acquires a great deal of wealth. Some monasteries, despite Benedictine reforms that suggest, kind of vows of poverty in some cases, or at least not access to a great deal of profit, some monasteries do actually pull in a great deal of revenue from some of the work that they provide. And there are also, ways that the Christian church does kind of struggle as a power base. It will try to become an additional power source in addition to monarch. So it becomes a layer of this power system that we were talking about in class with like merchants and other groups of people. There was going to be kind of a secular and also a spiritual type of ruler role. And then monks in monasticism and also nuns, there's a great deal of role for monks because they are preserving literacy and learning. In some cases, they are the folks who are scribing the books. There's also, in the manuscripts, there's also some role of a social system. What we can see here is you can kind of put in the, kind of space of the feudal triangle, the nobles have a certain amount of power, kind of nobles and knights, if you kind of get a sense that the church also has that, kind of high position in society, lots of people in the church. So it might be the Pope, who may be competing for power with the monarch. Kind of next in line might be cardinals and bishops. These are church leaders who have control of a whole region, not just one parish of one village, but quite a few parishes, so many, many churches. There might be also people who are monks who would be much kind of lower in the feudal hierarchy. And, in terms of the church hierarchy, the Pope and the cardinals actually pick the Pope for some time up until about the 1000s or so. The Pope could also be selected by an emperor, or at least had to be approved by an emperor. That's taken away, and it's solely done by people in the church known as cardinals. There's several cardinals, many cardinals, and in today's time, too, they also pick the Roman Catholic Pope. There's archbishops and bishops and priests, kind of these different layers of kind of regional oversight for the church as an institution. Lastly, there are issues in terms of this like papal power. You see an image here of Pope Gregory VII. He's one example of many, many, many popes who ultimately are trying to escalate their power, mostly in connection to a secular ruler. There are a bunch of reforms because the 800s, 900s, maybe thousands, we see secular rulers start to dominate. The Lateran Council in 1059 makes certain rules and reforms for the church. Basically,